Hello, I'm Christina Wyckoff. I am the Section 106 coordinator and historical archaeologist here at the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office. And welcome to our Lunch and Learn presentation. Today, it's my pleasure to be joined by Mike Kertok. Mike is a historic preservation architect in Norman who's been working with our office for more than 20 years. And Mike's presentation is on the Sanborn fire insurance maps. So with that, I'm going to mute and hand over to Mike. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Christina, and thank you everyone who's tuned into this. I want to start with a full confession here. This is my first virtual presentation. I've done live presentations before, but never before a virtual presentation. And I have to tell you, it's kind of weird sitting here. I feel like I'm just talking to myself like a crazy person, but I will soldier on here. If I were doing this as a live presentation, I would start by asking for a show of hands of how many people are familiar with Sanborn maps and how many people have never heard of a Sanborn map. But since that's not an option here, I'm going to assume that there are some people tuned in who are not familiar with Sanborn maps. So I'll be going over the basics. And if you are someone who is familiar, I ask you to just bear with me through that. And we'll get to some more advanced things as we go along. So the basic questions to start with are, and hang on to get this active here. There we go. What are fire insurance maps and why were they needed? Why did they come about? And fire insurance maps were developed in the 19th century. So to understand why they came about, we have to look at the 19th century and understand what was going on there. And for those of you who are mathematically challenged, the 19th century is 1801 to 1900. And to put that into perspective, in 1801, the United States of America was 25 years old. So people were still wearing powdered wigs back then. The 19th century was a century of significant change in the United States and around the world. In the U.S., the society was transitioning from an agricultural society to an industrial society. It was the Industrial Revolution. Then, as a result of that, people were migrating from the farms to the cities. And so cities became more built up, denser, more crowded. Another thing about the 19th century is that there were no building codes, national building codes, no national building codes. Cities had some building ordinances, but nothing like we have today. So there wasn't a lot of regulation on what you could build. Another thing about the 19th century was lighting. There was no electric lighting until very late in the century. You had whale oil lamps early on. Camphene came along. That's a distillate of turpentine. Then kerosene, which initially was distilled from coal and later from crude oil. The electric light bulb, patented in 1879, but took a while for people to get electricity into their homes and get light bulbs to use. So if you wanted to light up your home or business after dark, you were burning something. And candles also were still in use. And firefighting was pretty basic back then. You had bucket lines. In some cases, you might have what they called fire engines, not engines as we think of an engine. The engine referred to the pump. And these pumps were operated by hand. You had the strongest guys you could find pumping up and down on those handles. And you had a hose siphoning water out of a cistern or a well. And I imagine the pressure you got wasn't very good. So put all of these factors together and what could possibly go wrong? Well, how about New York, 1835, huge fire, 17 city blocks burned, 500 buildings destroyed. And amazingly, only 2 lives were lost. Pittsburgh, 1845, 2/3 of the city destroyed, 1,200 buildings. Portland, Maine, another huge fire, 60 city blocks burned, 1,800 buildings, 10,000 people left homeless. The famous Chicago fire of 1871, allegedly started by Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern. 3.3 square miles burned, 17,000 buildings, 300 lives lost, 100,000 people left homeless. Next year in Boston in 1872, 50 city blocks burned, 176 buildings destroyed, 30 lives lost. Throughout the whole century, there were about 24 major urban fires in the United States. And this is not even counting the hundreds, no doubt, fires in small towns and medium-sized towns that destroyed blocks. So there was a need for fire insurance. If you had a building in any of these towns or cities, and you probably wanted to protect it. And so we need to talk a little about fire insurance. And I've divided the century up into roughly thirds on this chart, 1800 on the left, 1900 on the right. And so the first third of the century, you have the growth of the fire insurance industry. In the second third, you have geographic expansion and evolution of fire insurance maps. I'll explain that as we get into it. The Civil War falls in the middle there. And then the last third of the century is where you really have the growth of fire insurance maps. Now, fire insurance has been around in this country since the colonial days. British companies insured buildings in the colonies, and companies started forming in the colonies. There's one that was formed in Philadelphia by Benjamin Franklin, and yes, it was that Benjamin Franklin. And so in the first third of the century, there was a growth of fire insurance. This came about for several reasons, not just the need because of the fires, but specifically in the United States, the War of 1812 occurred, and after the War of 1812, people didn't want to do business with Great Britain. Funny how that happens when they burned down the White House. There was an increasing prosperity in America, so again, more buildings, more businesses going up, more insurance needed to be sold. By and large, these were local companies insuring local properties. So if you were in Baltimore, you were insuring buildings in Baltimore. If you were in Philadelphia, you were insuring businesses and buildings in Philadelphia. And that, as it turned out, was a problem. Remember this, the 1835 New York fire? Well, one more not so fun fact about this fire is 23 of the 26 local insurance companies went bankrupt. And so insurance companies, the smart ones at least, figured out they needed to spread out geographically. They needed to start insuring businesses, buildings, and other communities and cities. And so we get to the second third of the 19th century now with the geographic expansion. And I'm going to go through this kind of on two parallel paths. One, the geographic expansion, and the other, I'm going to talk about the evolution of fire insurance maps, which goes back to even before this. And we'll start with that. In 1790, insurance company in England commissioned a map of Charleston, South Carolina. And this is not really, what we think of as a fire insurance map, although it has some of the components in there that we'll see later on. You have the individual buildings shown. They are coded as to whether they were wood construction or brick construction. And it does mention down here that at the bottom of this list that there were 9 fire engines belonging to the city. And of course, we know that means basically a pump, a hand pump. So this is kind of the start. And the reason that the company wanted this map, of course, is that they were needing to insure buildings that were far away from where they were located and needed to know something about them. Another thing that happened at the end of the 18th century and starting into the 19th century was the invention of lithography. And this made it a lot easier to print things like maps. That map we just saw probably had to be printed with a copper plate etching, which takes a lot of time to do that. So that contributed to the development of the maps. There was a 1834 map of New York, A Fireman's Guide to New York. Some of the sites you see talking about the history of maps mention this. Again, not really a fire insurance map. This is more a map of the fire stations and where they were located and what kind of equipment they had, and showed buildings where there were cisterns where they could siphon water to fight fires. And as far as I know, this is the only sheet that map had. I don't think it had more sheets, but I'm not sure about that. But at that point, let me shift over to the geographic expansion of the fire insurance companies. And so we saw that in 1835, that was a game changer. And so companies had to expand out, but there were some obstacles to that. One of them is that travel was not very easy in the 19th century, especially the early 19th century. The quickest way to get around was by train, but trains were not particularly fast. And those speeds you see there, that doesn't take into account having to stop at stations along the way. So the average speed goes way down when you do that. And if you had to go somewhere where there weren't railroad tracks, well, you had to rely on literal horsepower to get there. So getting around was not easy. And you had to get around because you had to assess the risk. If you were going to insure a building in another city, you needed to know something about that building. So you needed to know, if you wanted to insure it and how risky it was and what kind of premium you wanted to set on it. So you need to get all this information. So, of course, insurance companies started employing agents out in the field to try to collect this information. But it was still the home office that decided whether they're going to insure a property, just like when your insurance agent today doesn't decide that. He's just the go-between. So these agents were sending in reports, but written reports were not really all that adequate. So they may have started putting little diagrams in the reports, and insurance companies began making maps, employing people to draw maps for their internal use. And all that just kind of built up. Then in 1852, William Parris prepared a map for the Jefferson Insurance Company in New York, but I guess was for use of all the insurance companies there. And this is considered the first fire insurance map. If you look at that, we see a map that, if you are familiar with Sanborn maps, this resembles now a Sanborn map. It's fairly primitive compared to the later Sanborn maps. It doesn't give a lot of information, but it shows the buildings, the footprints of the buildings. There's a color coding that indicates type of construction. Not a lot of other information. There's some buildings are identified as to what they are. You see a series of black dots on the building. Those were a system to indicate the risk, the hazard risk of the buildings. One dot was not very hazardous. 4 dots was hazardous, something going on there where there might be fires or forges or what have you. 1857, Ernest Hexamer made a map of Philadelphia. I know it says 1858 over there, but that was volume 3. Volume 1 was 1857. And the Hexamer map looked a lot like the Paris map. A little more information here. He shows the height, the number of stories of the buildings. So things are building up here. And then in 1866, Daniel Sanborn was hired by the Aetna Insurance Company to prepare some maps in Tennessee. And he thought, there might be something to these fire insurance maps. I might be able to make some money off of this. And in 1867, he published his first map of the city of Boston. And this is starting to look a little more like what we will see in the Sanborn maps as we progress along here. There's a lot more information going on here. So this is how we get to the Sanborn maps and development of the maps. Sanborn, as I said, there was not the only one doing these maps. There was William Paris, Hexamer, Whipple in St. Louis, Rasher, Dakin, several others. So it wasn't just Sanborn. A lot of people got into this business. Looking at the Sanborn Company, I have a little timeline of the business here. I'm not going to go through every one of these things. The takeaway from this is that during the first 50, 60 years of the existence of the Sanborn Map Company, they were just constantly, steadily increasing the number of maps, the number of cities and towns they were mapping, all the inventory of maps they had. And in 1889, they merged with Paris, and that increased their inventory. 1916, they purchased Hexamer, increased their inventory some more. So throughout these 50, 60 years, Sanborn really either bought out or other companies just couldn't compete with them and went out of business. And so by the 1920s, Sanborn had a monopoly. And I would say they were the Amazon of Sanborn maps, but Amazon has competition. They had no competition. They were it. And so for that reason, when we say Sanborn map, that has become synonymous with fire insurance map. Like Kleenex is synonymous with facial tissues. So let's talk about Sanborn maps, do a little Sanborn 101 here. Sanborn maps, most of them are 25 inches by 21 inches, pretty large size, printed on heavy paper. They did print some double size sheets in some occasions that were folded. Later on in the company's history, they made some reduced size maps, but most of them are this size. The number of sheets for a given town or city varies. If there were more than 100 sheets, they were collected into volumes. For the big cities, those volumes were about 100 sheets each. They could be 80 sheets, 120 sheets, just depended. In those large volumes for the cities, the first thing you will come upon is a title sheet like this. They spend some time on these things, drawing these out. They're pretty kind of incredible. They're really works of art. And in fact, there's a whole blog devoted to these. I put a link that you can find over on the right side there, if you're interested in that. Then the second sheet you will come across in the large cities, and the first sheet you'll come across in the smaller towns is an index sheet. So let's go through the index sheet here and see what kind of information you can find on that. We'll start on the right with the smaller town, Chickasha, Oklahoma here. You will have the name of the town. You will have the date that the map was published. You will have some basic facts about the town, the population. You'll have facts about the water facilities, important when you're talking about fighting fires. And you'll have some information about the fire department. If it's a volunteer fire department or a paid fire department, how many men, what kind of equipment did they have, how many feet of hoses and what size hoses. In the early maps, you'll have how many horses did they have. You'll also find on these index sheets a key. This is a pretty basic key right here. I'll show you some better ones later. There will be a map of the state showing the location of the city of town. The main part of the map here is a graphic depiction of the city or town, the blocks and streets, and the color coding with the big numbers in there refer to the sheet numbers for those areas. The colors don't mean anything here on this map, just separates the areas. Down at the bottom, let's see, there we go. Down at the bottom, there's an index, an alphabetical index of streets. Numbered streets are given by name, so 6th, 7th, 2nd Street are under S, 10th, 3rd, 13th Street are under T. So if you know the address that you're looking for, you can go to that index. If you know the intersection, you go to the map above there. There's also in that index a list of specials, they call it. These are named buildings in the town. These would be government buildings, hotels, schools, anything like that. So if you're looking for a specific named building, you might find it there and find what sheet you need to go to. On the cities, the big cities, the index will take up a whole sheet or even more than a sheet. So there'll be an extra sheet just with that. The big city indexes are very similar to the small. You have a key. Here's a better one. You have information about the water facilities, the fire department, the date, all of that business. You'll also find on these maps where there are multiple volumes, there'll be a graphic map showing you where the area that each volume covers. So you can find which volume you need to go to find what you're looking for. On this map here, I'll just mention quickly, there's a correction record. We'll talk about that more later. And there's, since this map was printed in 1946 during World War II, there's a little disclaimer, or just right after World War II, there's a little disclaimer here that says, don't let this map fall into enemy hands or you'll be in big trouble. In the big cities, another sheet you might find at the beginning of the set is what they called a map of the congested district. This is an overview of the downtown area with not a lot of detail. This is similar to what they used to call block maps that insurance companies made for themselves before the fire insurance maps came along. So you might see that. So let's take a look at a typical Sanborn map sheet here. Actually, this is not entirely typical. I chose this one because it has this really neat roundhouse on it, but it has a lot of the typical features on it. So when you get up on these individual sheets, you will usually find the name of the town and the date. Some of the earlier maps did not have this, and they figured out that if a sheet got separated, it was kind of hard to figure out where it went. So they started putting this on all the sheets. Up in the corner there, the biggest number you'll see on any sheet is the sheet number, up in either the left or right corner. Along the edges of the sheet, if you look over in the image at the left, you'll see at the top a number 9, along the left edge, number 8, number 11, on the bottom edge, number 15, the second largest number on the sheet. Those numbers refer to the number of the adjacent sheet. So if you're on this sheet and you want to see, I'd like to know what's across the street over on that next sheet, you don't have to go back to the index sheet. That'll tell you which sheet you need to go to. And there are 2 numbers on the left side there because the sheets are offset there. So that's why you have that. Sometimes you'll see a 0 on the edge, and that means there's no adjacent sheet. Every sheet will have a north arrow. And somewhere on the sheet, they just fit it in wherever they could. The north is not always up. They arrange these sheets to fit the information on there the best way it would fit. You'll always see a graphic scale. Most maps are drawn at 1 inch equal 50 feet or 1 inch equal 100 feet. The congested areas downtown were 1 inch equal 50. You get into the residential areas where it's not as congested, they would do those at 1 inch equals 100 feet. Basic information you can find on the sheets include the streets and the lots. If you look at the map on the left, and if you look closely, see if I can kind of highlight it here. There along here, there's some writing that says original town. That means it's the original town plat. And in the middle of each block, you will see a bold number. That's the block number from the plat. You'll see the outlines of the blocks, the property lines, lot lines within the blocks, the lot numbers, which are from the original plats, street names, street widths. So down here we have 80 feet, and up here the alley 20 feet. This is the distance between the property lines, not the distance between the curbs. You'll also have indications showing water lines under the street, what size they were. Over in the corners here, we have a black dot. That's a fire hydrant. It says DH there because that indicates a double hydrant. Oops, let me go back here. I missed one. Okay, sorry, there it is. So that's a double hydrant, has two fire hose connections. There are also single hydrants, triple hydrants, quadruple hydrants. So moving on to, let's see, one more thing about the streets and lots. You will find the building address numbers written on the street side of the buildings. Sometimes addresses changed, and the Sanborn maps would show the new address and the old address in parentheses. Let's look at keys for a minute. There were lots of different variations of these keys. Some were more extensive than others. Some had a lot different information from various cities that had underwriting requirements and such. There is a link to the left for a good key that you can access and download and print if you want to do that. We'll go over some of the symbols and things in these keys now and look at some of those. First thing you notice when you look at these Sanborn maps is the colors. And the colors indicate the construction materials used for the individual buildings. So you have yellow for wood, pink for brick, blue for stone, which also was used for concrete block. You have orange, brown, meant fireproof construction. Usually that meant reinforced concrete. You've got warm gray for adobe, cool gray for iron. They called it iron. In the early days, iron was used to build buildings. Then it went to steel because it was stronger, but they still called it iron. You might even find some tin, like corrugated tin siding indicated on the maps as iron. So that just covers a variety of metals. And green was used for special hazard, but it was only used in the early maps. It was around 1910-ish they stopped using green because the green doesn't really tell you what the building is, if it's wood or brick. So they decided, we don't want to do that anymore. We can just list on there what the use is, and if you'd know if it was a special hazard. So we see here, BLSM is a blacksmith shop, a paint shop. Obviously, you have flammable liquids there. Mattress factories, the stuffing they used in the mattress was flammable. You could, one more thing here. There's, I'll give you a little fun fact here. Sanborn maps were printed with black lines by lithography, but all of the colors you see on a Sanborn map were colored in by hand with watercolors and brushes. And the reason they did this was they didn't sell a lot of these maps. There were only so many insurance companies in a town or a city that would buy a map. And so they might sell 20 copies of a set of maps, and they figured out it wasn't cost effective to make a plate for every color. It cost less to just hire someone to color in these maps. They made little wax paper friskets to put over the maps to guide the colorists, and that's how the maps were colored. Now these examples here are buildings that are pretty simple, all wood, all brick, or mostly brick. You get combinations of these things too, wood with brick veneer, etc. Brick with a wood porch, brick with a stone facade, stone with a brick facade, etc., etc. You could also have some of these could get pretty involved, and you could get something that looks like these. My father would have called these a mishmash. That's not a technical term. Let me talk about, let's go over to the left side in the center there. There's something I have listed as wood with brick nogging. I came across this building when I was researching another building, BR Nog, brick nogged, and I had no idea what that was. So I had to look that up. And it turns out that it has nothing to do with a Christmas beverage. Brick nogging is when you build a wall out of wood, either studs or timbers, and you fill in the spaces in between the wood members with brick. That's brick nogging. So you learn things when you look at these Sanborn maps. Next thing you can find on Sanborn maps are construction details. There are symbols that tell you how the building was built. Over there on the left side, starting with the large number in the corner of the building, the largest number that is inside any building is going to be the number of stories. Next to that, you see 32 feet, which is pretty self-explanatory. That's the height of the building in feet. On the front there, you see a dashed line that's indicating a wood canopy. And there's a 1 there, so it's just on the first floor. Above the first floor, there's a wood canopy. Along the left side, there's a series of numbers, 16, 12, 12. You'll see that on brick buildings and stone buildings. That will indicate the thickness of the walls. In this case, 16 inches at the first floor and 12 inches at the second and third floors. The little symbol down below there that looks like an antenna, that indicates that there is an 18-inch parapet on this building. If you look down the lower left corner, that's from the Sanborn key that shows you how that symbol is used. Each of those strokes across there is 6 inches, so 3 strokes is 18 inches. The symbol is aligned with the back of the building, so that parapet is along the back of the building, and then there's a line that extends from that symbol around the other 2 sides of the building, so that parapet extended around those 2 sides as well. Over on the right side, you have some symbols that tell you what the roof construction is. An open circle, non-combustible roof, metal slate tile, asbestos shingles, solid black dot composition roof, coal tar, asphalt tar. Shifting down to the bottom for a moment there, an X is a shingle roof. In those days, the early days would be cedar shingles. Then in the middle there, you have a fire escape, FE, and then there's a symbol that looks like 3 lollipops with a slash through them. Those indicated, and from the Sanborn map in the lower, the Sanborn key in the lower right corner, you see an explanation of those symbols. That indicates here that there were windows on that side of the building on all 3 floors. Another thing you'll find on Sanborn maps is an indication of the occupancy and use of each building. So D means dwelling, that's a house. If there are crossed diagonal lines on a building, that is a stable where horses were stabled. Where you had horses stabled, you had hay. Hay is flammable. F means flats or apartments. A indicates that automobiles were stored in that building. It's a garage. S is an indication of store. You'll see that, or a lot of times they'll list exactly what type of business was in that store. As you see, there are barbers, shops, jewelry shops, general store. GRO is grocery. And then sometimes down here in the lower left corner, you'll come across something like DG, B, and S. And you'll just scratch your head and wonder what the heck that is. As it turns out, DG is dry goods, B and S is boots and shoes, and I have a link on the right side to a nice list of Sanborn map abbreviations. So when you run across something like that, you can look it up and figure out what it is. And I want to show you a couple of other occupancy and use notes here that I came across that I found rather amusing. One here is the Holiness Tabernacle, and they put in here cheap construction. Well, I guess we kind of know what that building was like. You don't usually see that on these maps. Another one you don't usually see here. I've been told that I am full of rubbish, and here's a building I can relate to, I guess. All right, Sanborn maps were issued at irregular intervals, just depending on how big a town was growing and what the demand was for it. I just picked a few towns in Oklahoma here and listed all of the different dates of the maps that were published for each town. And so you see it's, there are a lot of different dates going on here. 3 of these start in 1894, and that's not a coincidence, I don't think, because 1889 was the land run in Oklahoma, and so 5 years later, the towns were kind of built up, so they started mapping those. And you'll see most of these end in the mid to late 1920s, 1931 there for Lawton. That's because Sanborn started in the 1920s a system where they, instead of reissuing a brand new set of maps, they put what they call pasters on the map to correct the maps, to bring them up to date. They actually started using these very early in 1876, but they didn't use them very much until the 1920s, when they really started using them all across the board for all their maps. And these pasters are a bane of researchers. Here's a couple of maps. On the left there is the Oklahoma City map, one section of it from 1922. This was the brand new map printed up in 1922. And it was the last full map they printed out for quite some time. And they started putting pasters on this to correct it, to update it. And you see here by 1950, that same section of the map, that's the same spot. You can see the addresses there and this along the street. You see multiple layers, paste over and paster on top of paster on top of paster. And for a researcher, it's frustrating because there's something underneath there. You can sometimes see there's a little transparency over here, and you can see under one of them there's a building that wasn't there in 1922, and then it was there, and then it was pasted over, so it's not there anymore. And the thing is about these pasters is you just don't know when each particular paster was put on there. There's a correction record you'll find on the index sheet. They sent people out from the Sanborn company to update these maps and to apply these pasters, and they kept a record of that. But you don't know when each individual paster was put on there, and so that's a problem when you're doing research. Sometimes they would reprint these maps later on. So like this 1950 updated Oklahoma City map, which was first printed in 1922, they reprinted that in 1955. But you can see here on the reprint that they actually reprinted it from a map with pasters on it, because you can see the offsets of some of those pasters where they weren't applied quite exactly in line. Sometimes Sanborn would reissue a whole new sheet for a set, and if they did that, they would list the date that the sheet was issued below the sheet number. So you had these updates to the maps through the years. Let's go back to the Sanborn timeline here and bring that back up to date. We left off in the 1920s when Sanborn was a monopoly. And in the 1930s, the Great Depression had an effect on Sanborn, just like everyone else. Their production was reduced. 1940s, things picked up again. They made maps for the U.S. Army during the war. But then in the 1950s, things started slowing down again for a couple of reasons. Insurance company mergers were bringing companies together, so that whereas in before that you might have 20 companies in one city that needed your maps, then maybe there are only 10 that needed maps. And also the insurance companies went into a system they call line carding. They started doing that for properties that weren't shown on the maps, and then they started extending that into properties that were shown, and decided that they could do that instead of using the maps. And Sanborn responded to this by starting to print some reduced size maps. Here's a page from a publication Sanborn put out for insurance agents to explain how to use their maps. I've got a couple of links over on the right side. This was printed in 1940 at first, and then it updated in 1953. And then it tells how to use the maps, and it kind of explains everything we've just gone over about the symbols and everything for the insurance agents. And this page I've got up here is from the 1953 map, where they're explaining about their new reduced size maps, which are 11 by 13 inches. And the amusing thing in here, for me at least, was in the middle here. I'll read this one's paragraph. Stripped of bulkiness and excessive weight, it is easily carried, talking about the bound volumes of maps, easily carried from a map cabinet to a conventional desk. Female employees can handle this compact product with ease. So they were looking out for you, gals, back in 1953. Moving forward, Sanborn made its last new fire insurance map in 1961. Demand was falling off, and 1977 was the last year they updated maps, and then they were out of the fire insurance map. But Sanborn was pretty smart, and they saw the handwriting on the wall, and they started getting into other mapping services, and they still exist today. They call themselves Sanborn Geospatial. You can look them up on the interweb if you like. So let's take a look at how these Sanborn maps can be used and integrated with other resources when you're doing research, and how you can coordinate this all together. And I've got a block here from Chickasha, Oklahoma, and I chose this because there's a nice sequence of maps for Chickasha. So that's one reason. Here you see the Leland Hotel on the corner of the block. There's not a lot of difference between these two maps, but you'll notice next to the hotel on the 1894 map is a vacant lot, and in 1898 there's a building there. And there's a photo here from the Oklahoma Historical Society that was dated 1898. You can see here, this is the Leland Hotel. It matches up with the diagram in the Sanborn map. It's a two-story building like the Sanborn map shows. It's got this angled corner on it like the map shows. It's got this canopy over the first floor like the Sanborn map shows. Everything ties in there, so we're pretty confident that this is, in fact, a picture of the Leland Hotel. And you can see next to it, there's a building with a sign sticking out there that says Short Orders. And over on the 1898 map, you can see that building there is identified as a restaurant. So that ties together. And so we see here that this picture, well, it wasn't 1894 because there was no building next to the hotel then. 1898, there was a building. So 1898 is a plausible date for this photo. So let's move on to the next map in the sequence, 1902. And you see there's a big change here. On the corner of the Leland Hotel isn't there anymore. And there's a outline of a pink building and a note that says hotel from plans. Well, something happened in between these two buildings, and we go to a newspaper and we see a newspaper account that there was a fire in 1899. It burned down the hotel and most of the block. And then we go forward to 1902. Newspaper says there's going to be a new hotel built on the site where the Leland Hotel was. And that was in January 1902. March 1902, Sanborn map was published. So a Sanborn field surveyor came through here. They just started working on this building. They might have had the foundation started. He probably went to the foreman on the site there and said, hey, let me see your blueprints. And he looked at those blueprints and got the size of the building, and then that it was a two-story building going to be built out of brick. And so he put that information on his map that he sent back to the headquarters to be drawn up and printed. And so the hotel was listed there, but from plans. It wasn't yet completed. So moving on to the next one, by 1904, the completed hotel is there. You see here, there's a newspaper article talking about a restaurant moving into the hotel shortly after it was opened. And we see over on the 1904 map, there at address number 118, there's a restaurant shown there. This photo, somebody wrote on this 1903. I'm always skeptical when I see something like that because I don't know, did that person really know that was 1903? Were they guessing? But this is plausible. That's a photo of the Schaefer House Hotel. And that restaurant, the newspaper article said would be called the Schaefer House Cafe. And you can actually see in the window on that photo a sign that says Schaefer House right there. So 1903 is a plausible date for that photo. And shortly after, as we'll see, the name of the hotel changed. So there weren't a lot of years that it could have been for that photo. Next photo, like I said, the hotel name changed by 1908. It was called the Hotel Savoy. And here's a photo. We see here the hotel. We're down here on the corner looking toward the left, showing that two-story building, the hotel on the corner. We see past that, down the building here at the end of the block, there's a two-story building. And in between, there's a bunch of one-story buildings. So we see the two-story hotel. We see the two-story building at the end of the block. In between, we see the one-story buildings. So this photo, again, it fits in to this time period between these two Sanborn maps. Move on to 1911, and we see a pretty significant change here. The map, the buildings in the center of the block, the one-story wood buildings are gone. They built several three-story brick buildings in the center. And we look at this photo, and we see something interesting here. We have the hotel on the corner. Down at the end of the block here, we have the two-story building that was there before. We see one three-story building here right next to the hotel, but there are still one-story buildings beyond that. So this photo had to be between these two maps. That one three-story building built here next to the hotel was built before these other three-story buildings were built. So the maps are useful there in tying down where, when this photo was taken, if you didn't know. We can also coordinate these photos with city directories. Here's this 1910 city directory. We have Sanborn maps from 1908 and 1911. We can take a look at that on Chickasha Avenue. On the even number side of the street, we have 114, 116 Savoy Hotel. That agrees with the Sanborn map. Going down here, we have Row GE Confectioner. And we see here in 1911, and at 116, we have a confectionery shop shown. There's a little discrepancy in the address numbers there, but not anything major. We have further down a barber shop shown on the city directory. And again, on the Sanborn map, we show a barber shop. Further down the block, city directory shows 120 Del Monte Hotel. That was that first three-story building we just saw. The next year, 1911, that's listed as vacant, so I guess they went out of business. Further down, again, we have Hotel Prince in 1910. Here it's called the Hotel Albany in 1911. Further down the block, there's a pool room, 128. Over on the 1908 map, we see that listed as a billiards parlor. 1911, it's vacant. So, again, another tool here in the toolbox, coordinating these city directories with the Sanborn maps. Let's take a look now at how these maps were created. And as I mentioned, Sanborn sent field surveyors out to go out and draw all these maps up. And they published a field surveyor's guide in first about 1904 or 05, and then they kept updating that up until 1936. So they had a booklet published for these field surveyors that told them how to do this job. Unfortunately, I was not able to get my hands on a copy of this. I've never seen it, but I did just 2 nights ago, in fact, run across some diagrams that I believe are from this field surveyor's guide. So I'm going to go over those. And with the caveat that, number one, I can't say with 100% certainty that these are from the field surveyor's guide, but I'm pretty darn sure. And the other caveat is that these diagrams were appended onto another document that I found, that they were not part of that document. And the person who posted them didn't give any explanation as to where they came from or what they were. And I don't have the text that would have gone with these diagrams. So I'm going to give you my interpretation of them. I could be wrong, but we'll go through these because I think they're really interesting. So the first diagram was this base map. And all of what you see here on this base map can be obtained from city plat maps, which every county courthouse in every county in every state has on file plat maps for every city and town in that county. And these give all of the sizes, dimensions of the blocks and lots and streets, right-of-ways and everything. So these base maps can be drawn up to very precise scale very accurately because all of that information was available. All those measurements were available. You had the name of the plat here. This is shown as original town. You had the block sizes and shapes, the lot sizes and shapes, property lines, street and alley right-of-way, street names, all of this. And I believe this is what the Sanborn field surveyor would have started with. Now, what I don't know is, did the field surveyors go to the county courthouses and get this information and draw this up themselves? Did they send this information back to the home office and have it drafted up and then the map sent back to them? Or did the home office get this information and draft up the maps and send it out to the surveyors? I don't know that, but somehow I think they ended up with these base maps, and that's what they started with when they went out and started surveying. The next map in the sequence of diagrams shows the beginnings of putting information on the maps by the field surveyors and the type of information that the Sanborn company wanted them to put on there. Remember, this is from a guide showing the surveyors what they wanted them to do. And so it looks to me like here that maybe the first thing they did was just walk down the street and put in the street addresses and start drawing in the sides of the buildings that were facing the streets, because that's what this seems to show here. And then the next diagram here looks like this. Now this is starting to look like a Sanborn map. What I don't know, again, this was in a guide. I don't think this is really representative of what the surveyors sent into the Sanborn company because of all the colors on here. Especially in the early days, I don't think they were out there with colored pencils. I don't even know if they had colored pencils back then. But this is more of, again, a guide and instruction to the surveyors of how they wanted things done. Blowing up, going in tight here, you can see some cursive written notes that were telling the surveyors how to handle certain conditions and whether a building was to be listed as a dwelling or a flat, and things of that nature. So, I have some questions about this, but I wanted to show you this to give you some idea of what they did to get all of this information on these maps. They also provided, along with these diagrams, a key. At first glance, this looks like a typical Sanborn key, but this was prepared for those surveyors as a guide. If you look closer at it, here's a typical Sanborn key. And looking closer, comparing some of the things on these two keys, the standard Sanborn map key that you'll see on the published maps. For this diagram about the wall thicknesses, it says figures 8, 12, 16 indicate thickness of wall in inches. That is a description. If you look at this field surveyor map key, the same thing says show thicknesses of walls in masonry and concrete, blah, 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 in inches, placing figures as indicated. That's an instruction. Similarly, up here it says wall openings on floors as designated. That's a description. Down here it says show interior openings in masonry or concrete walls by the character in with figures from stories on which openings are located. That's an instruction to the surveyors. This map also includes some diagrams showing them how to handle multiple buildings under a single roof, and down here how to tell the difference between a 1-story, a 1.5-story, and a 2-story building. So the surveyors went out in the field armed with these guides and information here to prepare these maps. Now these surveyors were anonymous. We don't know their names. They went out, they did their job. Their names weren't listed on the maps. They weren't credited. We don't know who they were except for one, and that is Daniel Carter Beard. Dan Beard was born in 1850. As a young man in the 1870s, he worked for the Sanborn Company as a field surveyor. Later in life, he helped to co-found the Boy Scouts of America. That's his big claim to fame. And toward the end of his life, he wrote an autobiography, which was published in 1941, the year he passed away. And Dan Beard devotes one chapter of his autobiography to his time as a Sanborn map surveyor. And he provides us with some really interesting insight into how these maps were produced. So I'm going to read some quotes from his autobiography here. He says, "I measured all my distances by pacing, in which I became so proficient that a tape line was needless, for on a scale of 50 feet to the inch, no error could be detected." And for this reason, you will sometimes see Sanborn map surveyors referred to as pacers or striders. And the important thing about this is, despite Mr. Beard's assertion as to his accuracy, you need to understand that the buildings shown on these Sanborn maps are approximations. They didn't measure everything out to the inch. They paced them off and drew them up. In Bucktown, Cincinnati, I found a large square building. It was sort of a tenement house and the tallest building there. For that reason, it was desirable that I should get on the roof in order to see the roofs of the surrounding houses. Again, this shows us some of the technique they use to get those little symbols for the roofs that they put on the maps. So they were viewing these roofs from a distance, and you can pretty well tell what a roof is from a distance, but maybe at a longer distance, you might have to guess. We don't know, but mostly I think they were pretty accurate on this. Beard tells a couple of harrowing stories about almost falling off of roofs during his time as a Sanborn surveyor. So it's pretty interesting reading. If you can find a copy of the book, you should look it up. Map making was arduous work, but it was interesting and full of thrills. I located the puddling furnaces in the rolling mills, dodging the dripping white-hot ingots. At the blast furnace, I burned the soles of my shoes and scorched the coat on my back as I worked with my pencil and rule in the swirl and swelter of smoke fumes and hissing steam. We map makers got sick to our stomachs in white lead factories. Our lungs and nostrils are stopped up by the dust of cement works. We coughed and choked over the poisonous gases in chemical works and had not a few narrow escapes. But we made the maps and we located every steam boiler and marked down the horsepower of every engine. Obviously, there was no OSHA in those days. Beard tells of other harrowing encounters with dogs and bears even, and belligerent people who wanted to fight with him. Another quote, the last one from Beard I have here, is, "I made diagrams of all the houses in each town and city I visited. I took a delight in always putting into my records mention of real occupancy, genteel and disreputable." What the map you see here is from San Francisco, California. It's one block of Mission Street, Morton Street. I made an error there. I'm sorry. It's Morton Street. I wrote Mission Street underneath. So that's Morton Street in San Francisco. Morton Street in San Francisco was a notorious red light district. And if you look at the buildings along each side of the street, you will see them identified as female boarding. Female boarding was code for a brothel on a Sanborn map. So if you run across that, you know. All right, let's go to the controversial portion of the program and talk about race labeling. Sanborn maps were pretty coy when it came to prostitution, but they were very blunt when it came to race. Honest, I will submit, but blunt. It's no secret that in this country, for most of the history of this country, races were segregated. People of the same race or ethnic group lived in communities with other people of their same races and ethnic group. Sometimes this was by law, sometimes it was more of a tacit understanding. Sanborn maps give us an idea about this. They generally don't identify communities or neighborhoods by race. I'll show you one exception to that, but they do identify buildings by race. Now, I'm going to show you some examples of this. Don't shoot the messenger if I read what's on the screen. I'm just going to present this in a factual manner. Here we see some examples from a couple of communities in Oklahoma, but this is not just Oklahoma. This is all across the country. You will find, if you go through Sanborn maps, labels like this: Lincoln School, Negro; First Baptist Church, Negro. If you saw this, again, like I said, they didn't identify the community, but if you saw buildings within that community identified like this, you could infer from that the ethnic makeup of that community. Here in Laredo, Texas, we see buildings labeled Mexican Theater, Mexican Produce. In Pawhuska, Oklahoma, we have the Osage Boarding School, parentheses, Indian, which seems a little redundant to me. And there's a building labeled Indian Lodgings. Here in Reno, Nevada, 1899, here's the exception I talked about, or the only one I found, at least, of a whole community labeled by race, Chinatown. On the right side is a block from Los Angeles, California, 1906. You will see written across that block, the letters here, Chinese. You will see written across the buildings here along the left side, Chinese tenements. Up here on the right, the upper left side, Chinese FB. We know what FB means now, female boarding. There's even in the middle of the block here a building labeled Opium Joint. I kind of wonder about the Sanborn surveyor who walked into that building one day. So just to conclude this, regardless of what you may think about these labels, I would think we are fortunate to have this information. It's valuable information, and it's presented here in a way that's easy to access. You could get this information by going through census records, but it would take a lot of time. So I think we're fortunate to have the information, and I'm thankful we live in more enlightened times. While we're on the subject of race, I thought we'd take a look at the Tulsa Race Massacre and see what the Sanborn maps might show us about that. So on the left here is a map of the Greenwood district in Tulsa in 1915. This area was known as the Black Wall Street. It was the heart of the Black community in that area, and it had all the commercial buildings, the stores, the shops, the professionals, dentists, as you see here on the photograph, a thriving community. 1921, if you don't know the story, and I'm not going to go into the whole thing here, but in 1921, there was a race-related attack on the Black community. And if you want to find out more about it, you can look it up online. There's been plenty written about it. But the aftermath of that was this. It was complete destruction. Buildings were burned down and bombed. People were killed. It was a horrific incident. Looking at the Sanborn maps, the next map in the series we have is from 1939. So it's quite a bit later, 18 years. But we see here, the whole area has been rebuilt. New buildings, bigger buildings, more buildings, better buildings. The area really rose up from the ashes of the horrible incident in 1921 and was once again a thriving district for the Black community in Tulsa. All right, let's shift gears here and have a little fun with Sanborn maps. Now, if I were a Sanborn map nerd, and I'm not saying that I am, but if I were, I would go looking for famous buildings on Sanborn maps, like Independence Hall in Philadelphia, here on a 1916 Sanborn map. Or how about St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York on a 1919 map? I tell you, the Sanborn surveyor who drew that up put a lot of effort into that. Or how about Fenway Park in Boston? 1914. Fenway Park was built in 1912. 1914, they hosted the World Series. We have a couple of nice panoramic views here of the World Series that jives completely with the map there. I could do a whole series on old baseball parks on Sanborn maps, but I'm not going to bore you with that. Let's look at the Alamo in 1885. Interesting thing for me here is this huge retail building smack right up against the Alamo. I mean, who knew there was a Walmart right next to the Alamo in 1885? We looked at some famous buildings. Let's look at some infamous buildings now, starting with Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Here in 1888, the top Sanborn map there, you see it's listed as a medical institute. What happened after Lincoln was assassinated is, for some reason, people didn't want to go to see a play in the theater there anymore, and so the interior was gutted, and floors were built in there, and it was turned into an office building. And by the late 1800s, when this map was made, Medical Institute, there actually were agencies of the federal government. Medical-related agencies were in the building. 1916, on the Sanborn map, it is identified as Old Ford's Theater, and the War Department was occupying the building. Next, let's look at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona. The famous gunfight there occurred in 1881. The OK Corral building actually burned down the next year in 1882. The first Sanborn map we have of the building is from 1886, and so they apparently rebuilt the whole thing. But the gunfight, if you didn't know, actually occurred right back in this vacant lot here between these two buildings. But I guess the gunfight in the vacant lot between two buildings behind the OK Corral doesn't have quite the same ring as the gunfight at the OK Corral. The next one I'm going to show you here, I'm going to let you think about this for a minute and see if you can guess what this is. 2122 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois, shown here in a photo from 1929. That's a clue. The Sanborn map, it's down here toward the bottom here, shown as transfer storage. And if you guessed St. Valentine's Day Massacre, you were correct. Here's where that occurred. Now, the building's no longer there. It was torn down. Although one wall, the brick wall in the building where the gangsters were lined up and gunned down, that was salvaged. And then it was, I think it's in a bar somewhere in Canada, if I remember right. All right, the last one I'm going to look at here is this square building down in the lower right quadrant of this block in New York. It was built in 1902 here in 1904, shown on the Sanborn map. It was known as the Ash Building back then. And we can look at the Sanborn map and see that down here we have 10 BSC. It was a 10-story building with a basement and a subcellar. We see that it had 4 elevators in it. It had 100 feet of 2.5-inch hose on each floor, fire hose providing fires. It's colored to indicate that it's a fireproof building. Well, in 1911, on the top 3 floors of this building, they were occupied by a garment manufacturer that made blouses for women called shirtwaists. It was the, excuse me, it was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and there was a very devastating fire in that building in 1911. Over 150 people killed, most of them young women who worked in the factory. This incident, which occurred right about the same time that the Titanic sunk, this is basically the Titanic of building fires. Just like the Titanic didn't have enough lifeboats, this building didn't have enough fire escapes. There was one fire escape which actually collapsed under the weight of the people who were trying to get out and use it. But the building was built to meet the codes at the time, just the way the Titanic was built to meet the codes at the time. Stairwells in this building, the doors of the stairwells were locked. The fire hoses were, even though they weren't very old, they hadn't been maintained, they were rotten, they didn't work. So just like out of the Titanic disaster, there were changes made to requirements that you had to have a lifeboat for every people. Changes were made to building codes and ordinances as a result of this fire that improved the life safety of buildings. All right, I'm going to conclude this up with some discussion on where can you find these maps online or in other places. And the best source where you can find these maps is the Library of Congress. There's a link to the website on the right. It's also shown here. If you go to there, you'll get a page like this. Homepage. There's an advanced search button you can click on there, and you'll get a drop-down menu like this. You can enter the state you want, the city you want. You can even, I think there's not a date range here, is there? But you can enter that. You can get to the maps you're looking for. I've found that this menu can be a little squirrely. So there's also a menu along the left side of the page here, which I found works a little better, where you can find your state, find your city, and click on that. By the way, I'll mention here, because I don't show it on any other maps, Library of Congress has digitized a lot of the maps in their collection, but not all of them. There's still a lot they haven't digitized. If you see a symbol like this, it means that hasn't been digitized yet. But if you enter your state and your city, and do a search, you will get something like this. This is one I did for Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and it shows all of the dates of the maps available: 1894, 1896, 1898, 1901, and further down, if you scroll down, which I can't do on this screen, you'll see further dates. If there are more than one volume, they'll show each individual volume. If you click on one of those and go through one intermediate screen, you'll get to thumbnails of all of the maps in that set. And click on one of those, you'll get a page like this, and you can zoom on this, you can pan around on it. It's pretty interactive. It's a pretty good system they have there. And down at the bottom here, you can select a size to download the map. I would recommend using the biggest size, because the smaller ones are pretty pixely and not very useful. So that's your first source, the first place I would go looking for Sanborn maps. And one of the reasons for that is Sanborn copyrighted all of their maps. And to copyright a map or any document in the 19th and 20th centuries, you had to send 2 physical copies of that map or document into the Library of Congress and register it, and that's how you copyrighted it. So the Library of Congress had this really nice, huge collection of Sanborn maps, because they were all sent in there to be copyrighted. Now, in sometime around the 1970s, I'm not real sure about that date, so don't hold me to that in particular, but sometime around there, the Library of Congress decided that, hey, we should do something with all these duplicate copies we have here, because there was no internet back then, no online access to these maps. If you wanted to look at them, you had to go to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And so they thought, if we get all these duplicate copies and send them out to the 50 states, they would be more accessible to people, and we could also free up some storage space for ourselves. So they selected one institution in each state to receive all of these duplicate maps. And in Oklahoma, the University of Oklahoma holds the collection of Sanborn maps from the Library of Congress, duplicate maps. So you can go to the Western History Collection, the Western History Reading Room at the University of Oklahoma, and you can ask to see these maps there. A lot of the institutions that receive these maps, like the University of Texas, for instance, have digitized them and put them online, but Oklahoma, unfortunately, has not done that. So the only place to see them in Oklahoma is by going there. Other sources for Sanborn maps here in Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Historical Society has a collection of maps. They have some physical Sanborn maps, which I don't think they have digitized, but they also have a nice collection of maps from the Clarkson company. These are maps that Clarkson prepared mostly in Oklahoma. They went around to a lot of the smaller towns that Sanborn didn't cover. And so the Oklahoma Historical Society has these digitized. There's a link again on the right side that you can go to and explore these. Looking at other states, there's a pretty nice website from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And again, I have a link over on the right. You can get to this. And you can go in here, and they have a menu here for various states. So Alabama to Georgia, Hawaii to Maryland, alphabetical. You can click on one of those and get a list of those states and links to sites where you can find digital Sanborn maps from those states. You notice Oklahoma doesn't have a link there because, again, the University of Oklahoma has not digitized their maps. But other states have, and so this is a good resource. And you can always go to any search engine, type in whatever state you want, Kansas Sanborn maps, type that in, and you'll get links to sites where you can find these maps.